April 5, 1943. In the black waters of the Solomon Islands, the destroyer USS O'Bannon sliced through the night at flank speed. The sea was calm, the sky moonless, perfect hunting weather. But the hunter was about to become the prey. On the radar scope, a faint blip appeared on the edge of the screen, slow, steady, and alone. Lieutenant Keifer leaned in, tracking its movement. Surface contact, 7,000 yards. The blip crept closer. 2,000 yards now. Through the dark haze ahead, a shadow began to rise, its outline unmistakable. A submarine, Japanese, running surfaced and unaware. Lieutenant Commander Donald MacDonald stared into the darkness from the bridge, the faint shimmer of phosphorescence outlining something massive ahead. His heart sank. They were too close. The destroyer's 5-inch guns couldn't lower far enough to fire. Torpedoes needed hundreds of yards to arm. Depth charges would kill them both. Every weapon aboard, useless. Below deck, men waited for orders that didn't come. Silence pressed down heavier than the sea itself. Then, across the still water, a dark silhouette rose. The Japanese submarine surfaced, and unaware it was staring death in the face. MacDonald's jaw tightened. He had seconds to act. One wrong move, and 320 sailors would vanish beneath the Pacific. The crew of the Lucky O braced for a fight no one had ever trained for, a fight fought at point-blank range, with no room for error and no way out. But the story of how the Lucky O found herself in that impossible moment began 2 years earlier, on the morning that changed everything. When Japanese planes struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States Navy lost not only ships, but its sense of invulnerability. Battleships burned in the harbor, carriers fled to sea, and every commander knew the old doctrines had died in one morning. What the Navy needed now was speed, range, and flexibility, something that could fight a submarine one day and a carrier the next. From that urgency came a new design, the Fletcher-class destroyer. Longer, faster, and more durable than anything before, it carried 5 dual-purpose 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, and depth-charge projectors, an answer to every threat in the Pacific. Each was built to be a self-contained weapon system, quick to produce, simple to repair, deadly in a pack. When the USS O'Bannon, DD-450, slid down the ways at Bath Iron Works in early 1942, she embodied that new philosophy of total war. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin R. Wilkinson, was a career man with a calm voice and the patience of an engineer. He drilled his crew relentlessly, not for ceremony, but for reflex. He knew the ocean wouldn't forgive hesitation. By midsummer, O'Bannon joined the long convoy lines stretching toward the South Pacific. America was beginning its counterattack at Guadalcanal, an island few had ever heard of but soon every sailor would know by heart. Supplies, fuel, and lives moved along narrow lanes where submarines waited like wolves. Destroyers became the shields of the fleet. From her first voyage, O'Bannon proved fast, responsive, and unflinchingly aggressive. She escorted the carrier USS O'Bannon, launching Marine pilots bound for Henderson Field. She screened transports under constant threat from Japanese bombers. The men barely slept, living on coffee, adrenaline, and superstition. Someone painted Lucky O on the chart room door, a joke that, over time, stopped being funny and started feeling true. Through the closing months of 1942, Wilkinson's destroyer learned the art of night combat. In the black waters off Guadalcanal, radar replaced daylight, instinct replaced sight. Sailors fought battles measured in seconds, often within shouting distance of the enemy. No one thought about survival, only about doing their job faster than the other man. Then came November 12th. A massive Japanese task force was steaming toward the island, 2 battleships in the lead, intent on blasting Henderson Field off the map. Wilkinson received his orders: intercept at all costs. He didn't hesitate. O'Bannon joined Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's strike group, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 8 destroyers, against the most powerful surface force Japan had yet sent south. As night fell over Iron Bottom Sound, the sea turned black and the air grew electric. Radar screens began to fill with contacts. Officers whispered ranges in clipped tones. 5,000 yards, then 3. No one could see the enemy, but everyone knew they were closing. The order came quietly: commence firing. At 1 a.m. on November 13th, 1942. The calm of Iron Bottom Sound shattered. Searchlights cut through the rain, and the radar operators aboard O'Bannon shouted bearing after bearing until the screens blurred with echoes. 2 Japanese battleships, a light cruiser, and 14 destroyers were closing fast, nearly twice the firepower of the American line. Rear Admiral Callahan's formation, thin and improvised, had already committed. There was no retreat. From the bridge, Wilkinson could see nothing but flashes, white, orange, then blinding red as the first salvos erupted from somewhere in the dark. The ship lurched as her own guns answered, 5-inch shells streaking across 2,000 yards of black water. The enemy's return fire came seconds later, splashes of molten water exploding off the starboard bow. Men flinched, steadied, loaded, fired again. Training had ended. Reflex had taken over. Then the great shape appeared, the battleship Hiei, towering in the dark like a moving cliff of steel. Wilkinson turned hard toward her, charging directly beneath the arcs of her giant 14-inch guns. At that range, the battleship couldn't lower her barrels enough to hit the destroyer. O'Bannon was inside her shadow. Her 5 inches roared point blank, raking the superstructure, shattering rangefinders, igniting fires. The air smelled of fuel and cordite. Every gun aboard fired until the barrels glowed dull red. When the order came, torpedoes fire. 2 trails of silver cut through the water, streaking into the black mass of Hiei. One detonated amidships. The second vanished into the smoke. The shockwave rolled under O'Bannon's hull like an earthquake. Voices shouted over ringing metal, damage reports, ammunition counts, bearings. There was no sense of victory, only survival. Minutes blurred into an hour. Around them, ships burned, cruisers San Francisco and Atlanta, destroyers Cushing and Monson, friends and enemies locked in the same furnace. Radar contact after contact disappeared from the screens as ships sank on both sides. When dawn finally broke, the sea was littered with wreckage and drifting men. The Japanese battleship Hiei was crippled, smoke pouring from her decks, dead in the water. By afternoon, aircraft from Henderson Field finished what the destroyers had begun. She went down slowly, taking hundreds with her. USS O'Bannon limped away, scarred but alive. Her paint was scorched, antennas twisted, but her engine still answered, and her crew still stood. They had faced a battleship at knife range and lived to tell about it. For that night's action, O'Bannon and her crew received the Presidential Unit Citation, and the nickname whispered through the fleet hardened into truth. From that moment on, she was no longer just another destroyer. She was the Lucky O, a ship that had walked through fire and kept going. The months that followed Guadalcanal were a blur of sea and exhaustion. Victory had come at a price, ships lost, friends gone, and the constant hum of new missions filling every quiet moment. For the crew of the Lucky O, there was no rest. The Solomon Islands campaign still raged, and destroyers carried the weight of it, escorting convoys, hunting submarines, shelling shorelines, always moving, never safe. By the beginning of 1943, O'Bannon had a new commander, Lieutenant Commander Donald J. MacDonald. Where Wilkinson had been calm and deliberate, MacDonald was sharp and instinctive, a man who lived by split-second judgment. Under his command, the ship became leaner, faster, even more aggressive. The crew trusted him completely. In the Black Pacific, trust mattered more than armor. Night after night they ran the narrow waters sailors called the Slot, a corridor of sea stretching between jungle-covered islands, where radar pings echoed off mountains and torpedoes flashed out of nowhere. Rain squalls came and went like ghosts. Engines never stopped. Men slept in shifts of minutes, always one alarm away from battle. By April, O'Bannon had survived storms, air raids, and 2 near-miss torpedo attacks. But nothing compared to what waited in the early hours of April 5, 1943. After another long patrol up the Slot, the destroyer turned south to rejoin Task Force 18. The sea was glass smooth, the night completely black. At 2 a.m., a faint radar contact appeared slow, steady, moving at 11 knots. Lieutenant Keifer bent over the scope. Surface contact, 7,000 yards. MacDonald gave a short nod. Come to course 180. Let's have a look. O'Bannon heeled slightly as she turned toward the blip. Engines hummed through the deck plates. The smell of oil and salt hung thick in the air. As the range closed to 2,000 yards, watchmen strained their eyes through binoculars. The faint outline ahead grew clearer, a long, low hull riding high on the surface. a submarine running under diesels, unaware of the shadow behind her. MacDonald's mind raced. He ordered battle stations, then stepped to the bridge wing for a better look. In the dark haze, a thin shimmer of phosphorescence traced the enemy's wake. It was real. He could almost feel the weight of it through the night air. O'Bannon crept closer, engines throttled down to a whisper. Inside the ship, men took positions in silence, gun crews, torpedo teams, damage control, everyone waiting for the first command. There was no talking now, only the throb of turbines and the pulse of blood in their ears. They were less than 2,000 yards from a live enemy target, close enough to smell the exhaust of its diesel engines. MacDonald's eyes locked on the dark form ahead. He had seconds to decide: attack, ram, or shadow. One wrong move and the destroyer could explode before anyone fired a shot. The crew didn't know it yet, but the next few minutes would give the Lucky O the strangest chapter in her long war. MacDonald gave the order: prepare to ram. The destroyer's bow angled toward the target, engines surging to full ahead. Steel trembled underfoot as the Lucky O closed the distance. Men braced for the impact, hands gripping bulkheads, eyes fixed on the looming shadow ahead. Then, hesitation. Something about the submarine's hull caught MacDonald's eye, narrow lines along the deck that could be mines or externally stowed charges. If they rammed and hit one, O'Bannon would die with her enemy. He slammed his palm down. Harder starboard. The ship shuddered as the helmsman swung the wheel. The destroyer veered sharply, slicing past the submarine's port side, so close that seawater sprayed across both decks. The wave crashed over the Japanese sailors sleeping topside. For a moment, they simply blinked awake, confused. Then their eyes focused on what towered beside them. A grey wall of steel marked USS O'Bannon. Both crews froze. For one impossible heartbeat, they just stared at each other across a few yards of black water. The Americans could see their faces, their hands scrambling for the deck gun. MacDonald's men saw the flash of movement, knew exactly what was coming. The destroyer's 5-inch guns couldn't angle low enough to fire. The torpedoes needed distance to arm. Depth charges would destroy them both. Every weapon aboard, the same as nothing. The crew looked to their officers, waiting for an order that didn't exist. Then instinct took over. Sailors ran for anything they could find: wrenches, shell casings, toolboxes, anything to throw. Their hands hit the stack of brown burlap sacks near the galley hatch. Potatoes, hauled aboard just hours earlier from the supply run. Without thinking, they began hurling them across the narrow gap. The first potato hit the submarine's hull with a dull metallic thud. Then another, and another. Within seconds, a storm of starchy projectiles rained down on the enemy deck. Each impact echoed through the night like a grenade hitting steel. The Japanese sailors dove for cover, shouting, convinced the destroyer was throwing explosives. Some crawled behind the conning tower, others tried to toss the strange objects back, adding to the chaos. Above them, the Americans were half laughing, half terrified, throwing faster just to keep the enemy confused. The scene was absurd and deadly all at once. The Pacific's quiet, broken by the thump of potatoes against metal. Amid the frenzy, MacDonald seized the moment. Back engines, full astern. O'Bannon eased away, her hull sliding backward through the slick water. Every yard gained opened the gun's firing arc a little wider. 200 yards. 300. Guns target the conning tower. The 5-inch mounts came alive, recoiling with thunder. Flashes lit the waves. Shells struck home, tearing into the sub's bridge just as she began to dive. For a second, the night glowed orange, then went black again. MacDonald barked new orders. Depth charges. Pattern 3. From the stern, racks clattered open and heavy cylinders rolled into the sea. A heartbeat later, the ocean erupted. White columns of water leapt skyward, the destroyer's hull shivering under the concussion. Men held onto rails as the shock waves rolled beneath them. Silence returned slowly, only the hiss of steam and the groan of the ship settling. Oil filmed the surface in broken veils. Scraps of debris bobbed in the wash. Sonar faded, then snapped back with a ghost of a contact and vanished again. It looked like a kill, but the Pacific never confirmed so easily. MacDonald ordered a slow circle, holding position. No rising air, no bodies, no certain proof, only a smear of oil and empty water. Destroyer Strong joined the search before dawn, Both ships swept the area until the ocean went silent once more. The Lucky O had survived the closest knife fight of her war. Whether RO-34 had died here or somewhere beyond the horizon, the sea kept its secret for 2 more days until Strong wrote the final line. By the time O'Bannon reached port, the tale had already outrun the truth. What began as a confused radar report became a headline: U.S. destroyer sinks enemy submarine with potatoes. In reality, records later showed the Japanese sub, RO-34, escaped that night, leaking oil but alive. 2 days later, on April 7, 1943, she was rediscovered and destroyed by USS Strong. The myth chose a single night. History records 2. Yet myths endure because they carry something true beneath the exaggeration. The potatoes hadn't sunk a submarine. They'd bought seconds of confusion, and those seconds bought lives. Reporters never let go of the funnier version, and sailors never minded the credit. Soon the bronze plaque arrived from Maine, the smiling sailor frozen mid-throw. It hung in the wardroom for the rest of the war, a quiet reminder that improvisation can be as deadly as doctrine. When dawn rose over the Solomon Sea, O'Bannon was already gone, slipping south to rejoin the task force. Behind her, only oil and wreckage marked the spot where the submarine had vanished. No one spoke much that morning. The men cleaned the decks in silence, the smell of diesel and burnt powder still in their clothes. What they had done felt impossible, and yet the ship was alive, unscarred, and unbeaten. Through the spring and summer of 1943, the Lucky O stayed in constant motion. Convoys to escort, islands to bombard, ambushes to spring. Each night blurred into the next, black horizons, lightning over the jungle, radar screens flickering with hostile ghosts. Destroyer Squadron 21 had become the Navy's blade in the dark, and O'Bannon was always near the front of the line. At Kula Gulf in early July, the squadron intercepted a column of Japanese ships running reinforcements under cover of night. O'Bannon charged in beside 3 cruisers, cutting through the shadows at 33 knots. Gunfire erupted point blank, the sea exploding with tracer fire and orange blooms of flame. When the smoke cleared, an enemy destroyer was burning, a cruiser sinking, and the Gulf littered with wreckage. It had lasted less than 20 minutes. A week later, at Kolombangara, they met a stronger force, a Japanese cruiser with 9 escorts. The night turned to chaos again, torpedoes streaking out of the dark, searchlights slashing across the waves. The American line fired by radar alone, their shells punching through the rain. When the firing stopped, the cruiser Jinsu was gone, broken apart by concentrated 5-inch fire, and the remaining enemy ships scattered north. The Lucky O had survived yet again, her decks slick with rain and sweat, her gunners deaf from the roar of their own guns. For 2 more months, she haunted the slot like a ghost ship, unseen, unrelenting, always arriving where the enemy least expected her. She shelled troop convoys, bombarded beachheads, and fought off air attacks so frequent that the men stopped counting. By the close of 1943, the Lucky O stood among the most seasoned night fighters in the Pacific, scarred, tireless, and ready for whatever waited beyond the next horizon. By 1944, the map had changed. American arrows pushed west across the Central Pacific, island names multiplying on operations boards: Emerau, Hollandia, Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu. The Lucky O kept moving through them all, a grey constant against a rolling horizon. She escorted troop convoys that stitched the ocean together, screened carriers whose aircraft chewed at enemy airfields, and took her turns at the firing line when ground forces called for steel. When the Philippines campaign opened, O'Bannon rode the backbone of the invasion, guarding the lifelines to Leyte and later to Luzon. Each day brought new contacts on radar, new blips turning hostile, new bearings called in voices hoarse from sleepless shifts. The air changed in those months. Enemy pilots came lower, faster, and with a new, terrible purpose. Kamikazes fell out of cloud and sun in shrieking dives, and the destroyers were the last wall between suicide and the transports. O'Bannon's 5-inch mounts and rapid firers spoke until barrels burned, tracers reaching like welding rods into the sky. More than once the crew felt the slap of passing wings, smelled hot metal as fragments clattered across the deck. Then the ship steadied and returned to station, as if the sea itself expected it. Across the archipelago the Navy fought its largest battle, Leyte Gulf, an ocean-wide collision where old fleets died and the Japanese Navy lost the ability to decide the war by surface gunfire. O'Bannon did what destroyers do in such storms. She guarded, she warned, she screened, she stood by. When danger brushed the convoys, she stepped forward without ceremony. When the sky cleared, she fell back into the pattern that kept an army supplied. By 1945, she was with the carriers off Okinawa, the closest, bloodiest approach to Japan. Sirens and gunnery reports populated the logbook almost daily. The crew marked time in general quarters and quick meals eaten standing up. The ship's silhouette was a familiar one in those waters: scarred paint, patched railings, the subtle tilt of a vessel that had spent itself for years and kept finding one more hour of speed. Always there, always turning outward when the threat came. Then, suddenly, it ended. In August, Japan yielded. The Pacific went quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Admiral William F. Halsey chose 3 destroyers to escort the battleship Missouri into Tokyo Bay for the surrender. O'Bannon was among them, gray, alert, steady, the same way she looked on any other morning. Her crew lined the rails in dress whites as mountains rose out of haze and a city came into view. They had crossed the ocean from Guadalcanal to Japan and brought every man home. Peace did not erase the sea's habits. The Lucky O answered new orders in new decades, different uniforms, the same work. When Korea ignited, she sailed west again. Carriers needed screens, beachheads needed guns, and coastlines needed watching in foul weather. The destroyer that had learned to fight by feel in the Solomons now fired by plotted grid and gunline request, a patient metronome of 5-inch shells walking up a ridgeline until the call came to cease. Young sailors listened to old sailors explain how to read wind off a wave and when to trust a bearing more than a hunch. The ship joined those lessons together. In the early 1960s, the horizon changed color. At Johnston Island, the sky went white with tests that turned night to day and left the ocean strangely quiet after the thunder. O'Bannon watched the birth of a kind of power her generation had never imagined the first time she put to sea. Later, in a gentler duty, she joined the recovery flotillas for the Apollo missions, antennae tuned not for enemy emissions, but for the echo of a capsule falling home through the atmosphere. The same hull that had once hunted submarines now waited for astronauts, a continuity of steel across a century's turn. By the end of the decade, her logbook was thick with places and dates and names of men who had come aboard as apprentices and left as petty officers with sea in their bones. Paint wore thin on corners where hands had gripped 1,000 times. Engines that had pushed her through storms and night battles began to show their hours. On January 30th, 1970, at Pearl Harbor, she stood straight for decommissioning. Lines were made up, colors lowered with the exactness she had always demanded. Inside, the bronze plaque remained on the bulkhead, the one with the sailor frozen mid-throw. It was a joke and a memorial and a quiet oath all at once. The Pacific keeps what it takes. But some names ride its surface long after the hulls are gone. USS O'Bannon is one of them. 17 battle stars in World War II. 3 more in Korea. A presidential unit citation. And across all those miles and all those nights, not a single Purple Heart awarded to her crew for enemy action. Statistics become legend only when they agree with memory, and the men who served aboard her remember a ship that answered every bell and made room for luck by way of discipline. Admiral Halsey put it simply: the history of the Pacific War can never be written without telling the story of the O'Bannon. Time after time she was called upon to turn back the enemy. They never disappointed me. The story endures because it is larger than a potato and stranger than a manual. It is the story of a destroyer that stood too close to a battleship and fired anyway, that stared down a surfaced submarine with nothing that should have worked and found a way, that guarded the slow ship so the war could move forward. It is the story of sailors who learned that courage is a habit and ingenuity a weapon, that calm is a choice, that steel matters, but people matter more. The ocean is quiet now. Somewhere in that quiet, you can still hear a bell ring, a bearing called, a turbine settling into speed. And you can see a grey ship take her station, still turning outward, still steady, the Lucky O, doing what she always did: move forward and bring her people home.